He got going then, made it to the hatch, locked it behind him and got his gun ready in case the thing made it inside. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Kat. Let me start by saying a big thank you for all the support that you've shown and all the constructive feedback. It means a lot to me that people took a bit of their time to support me. For today I have something different for you, a spooky storytelling video. And I will split it into two parts, and I'll include the link to the story in the second part because I don't want y'all to go read it by yourself and skip my video. Now, let's dive right into it. Growing up, my best friend was Matthew Ramsey. He was a year older than me, but still in my grade. Not because he was stupid, but his father had died when he was in the 4th grade, and for a few months Matt was having a lot of problems at home and at school. When he got held back and put in my class, we became fast friends, and it wasn't long before I was spending more time at his house than my own. Matt's mom was always nice, but she was also working most of the time, so that meant we wound up hanging out with Matt's uncle Gene more than anyone else. He left us to our own devices most of the time, but if we were having a sleepover and Matt's mom had a late shift, Gene would come over and keep an eye on us until she got home. Those nights are some of my favorite memories of childhood. Hanging out with my best friend while his cool uncle cooked us hamburgers and told us stories he'd lived or heard during 20 years of traveling the world in the army. He was retired on disability when I knew him, and just looking at the pot-bellied, grey-haired man swinging a beer while absently poking at the grill, I had a hard time believing he'd ever been a soldier, much less the globe-trotting adventurer he told about in his stories. But when he settled down and started talking, everything seemed to magically change. Unlike a lot of adults, he seemed to understand and appreciate what we wanted to hear and were interested in. Tales of battle and exotic lands, guns and tanks, interesting people and dangerous creatures. As we spent time with him, I felt sure that he ran out of stories, but he never did. In fact, in the last years I knew him, he started telling us about some of the stranger things he'd ever seen or heard of. If it was someone else, I'd have immediately written these stories off as fantasy, increasingly elaborate and sensational stories to entertain his maturing and potentially jaded audience of two. But Gene wasn't really that kind of guy. He was a good storyteller, but he was honest, and I never got the sense that he was embellishing anything beyond putting a slight polish on a potentially dull tale. And while I can't say for sure that much of what he told us wasn't bullshit, what seems clear to me now is that one of his stories probably saved my life. This was when I was about 12 and Matt had just turned 13. We were going to camp out in the woods right behind Matt's house, and Gene had come over to hang out until we went to bed. He'd made a small fire in the pit in the backyard, and after some dinner we all sat around it, staring into the fire, while he told us about the time he'd spent stationed up in Alaska. He said for the most part it was just cold and boring. The towns up there were small, and the people, while pleasant enough, tended to keep to themselves. And the land was beautiful, but in an alien, almost hostile way that made him pine for the warm, dry hills of Arizona, where he'd been stationed for years before this latest assignment. His job there wasn't even interesting, just handling requisitions and hanging out with his boss, who spent most of his time drunk or asleep. Still, he told us, when his boss was awake and not too far gone, he was a pretty cool guy. He'd tell Gene stories about the people up there, local histories, myths and legends, and it was from him that Gene had heard about a woman that would sometimes came to your door asking to be let inside because it was so very cold. The way my boss told it, now the story changes from Gene's point of view. The way my boss told it, he was working at a weather outpost north of Anchorage when a big snowstorm came in. He had supplies for a few days, but by the third night he was starting to get nervous. He'd lived up north for a few months by that point, But this was the first time he'd felt really trapped by the weather. Between the increasing snow and the isolation, he admitted to letting out a scream when he heard a knock at the door. My boss was no rocket scientist, but he wasn't a fool neither. He knew no one was around for 20 miles or more, and the odds of someone being out in that kind of weather at night just made no sense. His first thought was that it was someone came to relieve him for some reason, but as he approached the door, he heard what sounded like a young woman's voice on the other side. "Please let me in. I'm so cold." This threw him off. There were no young female enlisted locally that he knew of, and the more he thought, he realized he would have gotten a message beforehand if someone was coming up tonight. "So who could this be?" Heart pounding, he answered. "Ma'am, who are you?" "I'm cold and lost. I got lost in the storm. Please let me in." It was so strange, but she sounded scared, and if he left her out there for much longer, she was apt to freeze to death. Still, 2 feet of snow had fallen since he'd cleared the front door earlier in that day. If he was going to let her in, he needed to go out there with a light and shovel and clear the way. "Okay, give me just a minute and I'll be out there." He put on his outerwear and headed up the ladder to the roof hatch that was mainly used for accessing the equipment up top, and when the snow got too high to use the main door. He told me it really was bitterly cold, the coldest he could ever remember it being, though some of that was because he was so scared. He told me that part of that was him being scared for the girl. He said another part of him could sense something wasn't right, that there was something strange and dangerous beyond just the oddity of a stranger out in the midnight cold. Said that was why he shined the light over the edge of the roof before he went down to clear the door. Jim gave me and Matt a nervous smile at this point, taking another sip of his beer before setting it aside. He said most of it was buried in the snow outside the door, but looking down he could still make out the top of something's body. Said it was huge, probably 500 pounds or more, with a segmented ivory shell like a lobster, and 40 white spider legs that sat tensed and ready, the highest arches like small drifts just breaking the snow surface. The worst part, though, was its head, because it wasn't a head at all, really. Over 5 feet tall and upright, the head had a slim and delicate shape covered in what looked like a dark poncho or cloak. Jim glanced between us as he rubbed the side of his face. He said he could see a face in that cloak, a woman's face, the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Shifting in his chair, he went on. But it saw him too. This look he got, it was all in a couple of seconds, and by then the thing had noticed the light shining down and turned that head that looked like a woman up toward him. He told me he'd been terrified by that point, frozen to the spot, and some part of his brain that was still working thought she would say something else to him, try to get him to calm down. Jim puffed out a breath, but instead it started to scream. He said that noise didn't come from the woman's mouth, but instead he saw puffs of snow along its body like steam escaping a pot, and the air was filled with this terrible screech. He knew it was angry, and it was coming to get him. He got going then, made it to the hatch, locked it behind him, and got his gun ready in case the thing made it inside. Said he heard movement on the roof, but nothing ever tried to get through the door or the hatch. He stayed awake until sunrise, and then he radioed for help, using the excuse that he'd gotten bad sick. Matt and I watched him wide-eyed and terrified as he gave us a small laugh and shrug. And that was it, at least for the most part. They came and got him. There was no sign of anything wrong outside, and he never told anyone above him about it. Jean leaned forward toward the fire. Until one night he was in town drinking and he buddied up to one of the locals. They were swapping bullshit for a while, and eventually he got comfortable enough that he told the guy about what had happened up at the weather station. Told me his drinking buddy got real sober real quick. Told him he was real lucky to be sitting there able to talk about it at all. I waved my hand at Jean like I was in class. So, this dude knew what it was? Jean gave an uncertain nod. Maybe, at least a little. Guy told him there wasn't some fancy name for it, but it was just something strange and deadly that lived up there. Maybe other places too. He'd heard a few stories over the years, and he had some grandpa or whatever that claimed to have seen one. Some people said it was an evil spirit. Others, some kind of animal we don't know about or understand. But whatever it was smart. Smart as a person and able to talk to you, to trick you. My boss just called it the liar, and he said he'd gotten that from his body. I figured it was because it had that lure, that part of itself that it could make look and sound like a person. But he said no. It was because, according to that he'd been told, the thing had certain rules it followed. It only preyed on things that invited it, that had been fooled by it to one extent or another. And whatever it said, it was always a lie, always. He pointed his finger at me and then at Matt. Now that might sound obvious, but it's actually a pretty useful thing to remember because the way I understand it, it can't tell the truth, and it's compelled to talk, to lure, to try and trick you into letting it in so it can get you. So if you ask it questions the right way, things that it cannot answer and things that give you away its lie, you can figure out what it is without ever opening your door. Jean sat back and gave a grin. I just hope nothing comes scratching at y'all's stand tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like this video if you like this video, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the second part. See you next Friday. Bye guys!